Here we are again, and I guess it's time to wind things up and give a sort of a valedictory discussion about about globalization. I'll try to make some generalizations about it and wrap things up, perhaps a little more briefly than usual. I have just made up a final. You should enjoy taking it. It seems very provocative. It's a choice of three options for it's two essays of the type that you've already written for the midterm. Um, uh, it's in two parts. First part is um, has three options, three different prompts, three different questions, and part two has four different questions. So you have quite a few choices on this thing, and you should be able to express yourself on whatever question you feel best shows your wares. And so I'll deliver that thing to you on Thursday, and then you'll deliver it back to me the following Thursday. So you have a lot of time to work on it. I suggest that you don't take all that time to work on it, but take a portion of that time, and don't do a lot of research for this thing. Just go through the materials that we've studied in this course. Go through your notes and all the rest of that, and cook your own thoughts. Um, at any rate, that'll be delivered to you on Thursday. Today, I want to talk about globalism and sort of wrap things up. And I suppose the best question to ask about globalism and wrapping things up is to ask if it's still revolutionary. And I suggested the notion very early in the course that globalism is very revolutionary. What do I mean by revolutionary? I just mean has the capacity to upset the status quo, to change things, and introduce a new order of things. Um, that's all. That's all I mean by revolutionary in this context. Revolutionary was as would be understood by a historian, and especially by a world a world historian, to change things and to, well, I guess there's a connotation when you say revolutionary, to make progress, to make progress. And I suppose when you say progress, you're really saying progress as we have been defining it since the 18th century, since the Enlightenment, that notion of progress. If we're thinking about the development of religious obscurantism, I guess that isn't progress. And if that's the change we're talking about, I don't know if we can say that's revolutionary. Um, but anyhow, that's the question that I wanted to start with. Is globalism still revolutionary? The term is no longer in style. It is not trendy at all. Everywhere you read in the periodicals, you see that people are saying that globalism is exhausted, globalism's in trouble, or it's simply kaput. It has had its time, and now we're entering into something new, and etc. So you don't see any kind of confidence about the thing. I've given this course 4 times, and in the first 3 times that I gave this course, um, I started out with the notion that globalism was very revolutionary, that is, say, very vital, very capable of changing the world. Um, and that was the first 3 times I did this thing. And this is the last time. And I don't know if I can say that. I don't know if there was a consensus in the world for this semester about globalism changing the world. And I'm just going by discussing the current paradigm, what gets currently discussed, what seems to be fashionable among the people who pay attention to these things and write in the most prestigious periodicals. So globalism's not in style. It's not trendy anymore. And so we have to ask the question, why not? Crash of 2008. There's an important hint toward an answer. The crash of 2008 more or less came as a kind of a climax to a whole period of globalization. Remember that globalization always carried the pretension that capitalism is going to be developing without limit, without regulation, and that on this new basis, that is, say, on a world basis rather than simply a national basis, that capitalism was going to solve all sorts of problems that it had in the early period of its development, and especially the tendency toward periodic crashes, the business cycle. So capitalism was supposed to solve that problem. And the climax of 2008 more or less put paid to the thought that capitalism would solve that problem. And worse than that, the crash was so severe, so intense, especially at the upper heights of the world economy, in the world of finance, it was so severe as to suggest that the crashes are not over, and we're going to have more of them. They're going to perhaps be even more intense as we go on into the future. Now, that was not something that was said 15 or so years ago, 10 or 15 years ago. But now the thought has started to sink in that maybe globalism is subject to crashes in the old way, and maybe it's susceptible to crashes of a new type. Also, we find a kind of an admission if you read the business periodicals and the other beltway journals and things like that talk about these things. We find a kind of a conception, a growing conception, I think, that globalism has been excessively crude and excessively plutocratic. As I say, it has been concentrating wealth at the very top of society, and that perhaps this tendency toward inequality is built into the thing, and maybe this is the way it's going. Maybe that's why it's not trendy anymore. At any rate, there is an increasing sense, I think, in elite periodicals, in elite expression of these things, an increasing sense that maybe the system is a little too cruel and a little too unequal, and that maybe something has to be done about that. And what other reasons could we cite? Well, globalism has certainly come up against a good deal of popular resistance and popular criticism. The year 2019 saw demonstrations just about all over the world. And then, of course, we have this pandemic. But in 2019, we could already see there was substantial popular resistance to it. So it starts to sink in that globalism is not going to perhaps be compatible with democracy over the long haul. And that's what's inherent in the suggestion that we are faced with trilemmas of various sorts, Danny Roderick's trilemma, or some other kind of trilemma. And Frieden, in his last chapters, takes up this whole questions of the problems facing us in terms of these trilemmas. The trilemmas usually involve democracy, and it comes down to the suggestion that maybe the thing is so unequal and cuts against so many people that you can't ask them for their vote at the end of that, and that perhaps democracy itself has to be changed in order for globalism to survive, or vice versa, Okay, then there's this pandemic that we are still immersed in and have still not seen the end of, although we're starting to get an idea we might be able to see an end to it, starting to visualize an end to it. Maybe it shows that globalism is capable of bringing the world so much in touch that this may not be entirely a good thing. Not to say the pandemics may be the norm from this point on, and we may be dealing with them all the time. That's another reason why I guess it's not trendy. Climate change also seems to suggest that we simply can't depend on petroleum, and that globalism has been based on an oil economy throughout the whole world. All the capitalism of the 20th century and our century has been based on petroleum. Maybe we can't go this way anymore. We are getting wildfires on a scale we never dreamed of. They're not just occurring in one or two places, but they're all over. They've got them in Russia, Siberia, in Australia, in California. Wildfires, hurricanes, rising seas, the whole ecology of the earth is being transformed. It maybe needs some kind of change, or maybe it's too late for this kind of change. But at any rate, one can no longer have confidence that this sort of thing is just a normal part of the landscape. So these are all reasons why globalism's not trendy anymore. I would say that maybe the biggest reason of all is that the wager of globalism, the world political wager of globalism on China, is not panning out. Globalism is based on a series of premises, but one of them is that China is playing a role in it. And even though China is a big power, potentially the biggest power, and is communist, that it is adopting capitalism. One of these days is going to be won over. And its success is only a reflection of capitalism, not of communism. It's not a success of communism. Um, and that sooner or later the Chinese will give up the ghost in the same way that the Russians did. Uh, and that was more or less the assumption in with which China was included in our notion of globalism, and that's getting entirely punctured. Um, it looks as if the Chinese are not going to turn into a capitalist society. All right. And it also looks as if perhaps some of their success is attributable, not to capitalism, but perhaps to the ability of the economy to plan and control, or I should say the ability of the Chinese state to plan and control how things go in China. Maybe that's sinking in as a possible factor. Um, and it's curious that the United States no longer seems to believe in globalism in the same way that it did. So we have increasing defectors around the earth, various countries that are thinking in terms of nationalism and denounce globalism. We have Poland, and Hungary, Brexit. People are not happy with the immigration features that seem to go along with a global economy, working according to a division of labor on a global basis. Um, Donald Trump came to power with a program of economic nationalism. And for 4 years, he has been denouncing globalism on the old basis. I mean, he hasn't done much to crush it, but maybe he's added a slight weight that maybe is tipping the balance against confidence in globalism in the future. He did say that the United States has to buy American, and we want businesses to repatriate into the United States. That's not very globalist in sentiment. And Biden seems to continue in that vein. He argues that we have to buy American. And perhaps there is going to be more continuity than change in the transition from Trump to Biden, at least on this feature of economic policy. It could be said that about the only big country that still hangs on to the idea of globalism is China. Or perhaps a better way to put that is to say that maybe China has more confidence in globalization than the United States does at this point. Um, so there we have it. The Chinese are putting themselves in the position of being the last globalist, and maybe the United States has to oppose China in this regard. And I guess the last thing you can say about this is what Kishore Mahbubani says, that globalism has turned into a project with Chinese characteristics. So the wager on China, so useful in the Cold War against Russia, now seems to be transforming, and we no longer have China on board, and therefore perhaps we are no longer globalists. Well, I don't know, trying to describe a mood, trying to describe the reasons it's based on, also trying to describe the sensibility, the kind of what might even be irrational, but is not necessarily rational, a calculation about things. all the things that go into the category of confidence in the future. Um, Globalism does not seem to be able to gather confidence behind it anymore. That paradigm is in definite trouble. And I couldn't say this the first couple of times that I gave this course. After this semester, I guess I do have to say that. Okay, so what does this mean for world politics? Well, what it appears to mean, what looks like is shaping up over the last year or so, is an economic and political war against China and Russia on the side on behalf of the United States. The United States organizing the G7 countries, and those are all the big countries around the Atlantic, plus um, um, plus Italy, um, Germany, um, um, and the Quad in the Pacific. So Australia, New Zealand, India, Japan, organizing these combinations against China. So what is this? Balance of power activity? These formations of coalitions against the threat of a regional hegemon? Is this what the British did in the 17th and 18th centuries, and especially the 19th century? Is this the balance of power coalition building against China? Could be, could be the modern equivalent of it. But it has to be asked whether all of business is going along with this thing. Maybe business has been sold on globalization. The Chinese have inherited, and business is not going along with this shift to hostility to China. I think you could say this about German business, Japanese business, South Korean business to a certain extent. They still like this Belt Road Initiative of the Chinese. They want to be in on it. They see profit in it. The Asian Development Bank that the Chinese have put in place, they want to get loans from this thing. They seem to be committed to this idea. In other words, they want to hang on to this globalism as it has developed into this Chinese vein. So it's going to be difficult to fight them. So the US is wondering right now how to sabotage the Chinese economic program for Eurasia, the Belt and Road Initiative. How about the Uyghurs? Can't the Uyghurs be supported in Xinjiang province? Can they be armed? The Turks already, it is said, have some influence among them and maybe in some clandestine way be helping them, encouraging them against China. And maybe this can be a way that we can put roadblocks into the Chinese campaign for the Belt and Road Initiative. So there are various kinds of thoughts that are being kicked around now. How to impede the economic organization of the world under the globalist slogans that is the organization that is now being directed by the Chinese. And this goes together with a continued hostility and antagonism toward Russia. So it's going to be China and Russia. Well, certainly every time sanctions are invoked against Russia, Russia draws closer to China. They've made a real effort to increase their trade, and it is increasing, and increase their cooperation on every level. And they are connected through this Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So maybe that's something that can be done to impede the development of this new form of globalization, perhaps with Chinese characteristics. So there's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization on a map that I think I've already showed you. This is a very optimistic version of it. The Indians are not full participants in it, but are observers and are interested in it, connected to it. And there's a certain logic that suggests that they may be close to it in the future. the problem of the antagonism toward Russia and China on the part of the United States. It seems to be developing in this last phase of globalization, or maybe you could call it a post-globalist phase of world history, is indicated on this map, which shows a nucleus of this um, Eurasian bloc: Russia, China, perhaps India, definitely Kazakhstan, um, and some others connected to, who are going to be attracted to this pole of resistance to the old form of globalization, that is, say, the old unipolar model on the part of the United States. So this thing is intended to demonstrate Russian, Eurasian, Chinese, Eurasian reaction against the old model of globalization led by the United States, and a kind of unipolar, as the Russian and the Chinese imagine it, and a kind of a unipolar framework. Okay, so this is the pattern that things may start to assume from this point on. I guess we have to ask, before we drop this topic, whether it's something that we have to wonder about. That is to say, is it a good idea for this thing to succeed? Would we like to see a revolution in China, for example? Would we like to see the expansion of Turkey, for example, some kind of pan-Turanian model encompassing the Turkish-speaking peoples of Central Asia, with Turkey at its head? Would we like to see China break up? Would we like to see Russia break up? Certainly we'd like to see these countries more democratic. But the question, though, would we like to see them weaker? And would we like to see, for example, the Communist Party in China overthrown and a fully capitalist China? You might say that'd be a real boon. That it would be the end of a big problem. On the other hand, could it be the beginning of another problem, and which might even be bigger? Let us say if China becomes fully capitalist, fully nationalist, and perhaps fully imperialist, a country operating pretty much the way the Chinese do, with all their international influence, all the capabilities, and especially the capability of building a big navy. Would we want to see a capitalist, nationalist, imperialist China of the 19th century, on the 19th century model, and that model of 19th century imperialism with colonies in various places in Africa, perhaps already invested in Africa? Would we want to see that? Or might it be better the way it is? Or might it be, let's put it in a different way, might it be easier to deal with the way it is? I think that's an important question that I never hear asked. Nearly everyone thinks it would be a splendid thing to see the Communist Party perhaps overthrown and China may be broken into its component parts. Well, that I can understand. A smaller, weaker China might be something the United States would be driven to desire. But the rest of it, a China that was fully imperialist and not bound in any way by its fealty to socialism and Marxism and all. Is that exactly desirable? It's a question worth asking. A question that, of course, is not asked very much, but I think it is. I think it is worth asking. In fact, there are a great many questions worth asking about Russia and China, and of course, most of them revolve around the question of whether it's a good idea to have conflict and perhaps war between us and them. So many make the argument that what we're seeing at the end of the globalist phase is that the world is returning to the situation of the 19th century, especially the relations among great powers and great economies of the 19th century. Well, if that's true, we may see new rentier powers. I say, we've been talking only about the United States as a rentier power. We were discussed fleetingly the British becoming a rentier power at the end of the 19th century. We've said that globalization and the financialization part of it definitely go in that same vein for the United States, and then these things might be compared by world historians, compared across the centuries, rentier powers. But maybe the logic of capitalism is to create rentier powers. In fact, that's what I've been arguing, that this was no accident that the British turned into a rentier, and no accident that the United States has either, and maybe it is a tendency that we're seeing. Well, if it is, then maybe others may feature um, in this tendency. Powers like Turkey or India or Japan, on a new basis, as mature, developed capitalist societies, that have extensions overseas and are foreign investment and are arming all the time and increasing their military power. Maybe they are going to become rentier powers on the model of Britain in the 19th century, the United States in the era of globalism. The expanse of globalist economic development throughout the world as we've seen it in this course still has a long way to go. I mean, there's more of the world to be globalized. And this, once again, it's a feature of the 19th century. It's enclosures, privatizations, big labor struggles. After all, they are doing the bulk of the industrial work in the world. So perhaps they will, outside of the old metropolitan centers, we'll see big labor struggles as countries develop big radical movements. We've already seen a good deal of that. The year 2019 showed the expanse of that tendency. Risings against austerity, campaigns against dictatorship, all of the things we saw in Europe, in European history in the 19th century, perhaps all over the whole globe, and a couple of other things that we might consider more hopeful. I, for one, consider them more hopeful. The development of a social democratic perspective in various parts of the world. I think the best example of this is in Latin America, and perhaps these Latin American social democratic experiments of various sorts in different countries might give us something of a more hopeful note in our vision of the 19th century, a return to the 19th century, or this larger idea of globalism, all the tendencies of globalism replicating the tendencies of capitalism in European and Northern Atlantic history in the 19th century. So we could say that globalism is simply a repeat. This has been said, that globalism is a repeat of the capitalism of the 19th century, except it's on a larger scale. Whereas the capitalism of the 19th century was confined pretty much to Europe and the United States, or I should say the capitalist industrial development, the Industrial Revolution of the 19th century, were confined to the Atlantic area. This will be read over the whole world. So we're going to see what we saw, so the argument might run, see what we saw in the 19th century, see it all over the whole world. What's not analogous, is not precedented, it seems to me, is the post-industrial side of that thing. The world is perhaps developing in such a way that the European countries are not really going to have any more industry, going to be entirely service economies. That really is new. Post-industrial development for what you might say call the whole trilateral world. Say for the United States, for Europe, for Japan, all the areas where the United States has the most influence. A post-industrial development, that is new for these areas. That is unprecedented. They will continue to develop the same trends toward inequality, I guess, that we have already seen exhibited. We're reminded of Mariner Eckley's famous statement about capitalism. When it's working the way it's supposed to work, acts like a giant suction pump, he said. A giant suction pump drawing money, redistributing money upward, in effect. And that seems to be the way it goes. And then quantitative easing at the top of this. That is to say that profits are, if they're not made by printing money, they are at least guaranteed by the printing money in an economy that has turned into a casino in which the biggest bettors at the top can't lose. Society, you might say, we were kicking this thought around, a society organized according to a kind of a permanent moral hazard. So that's new. That's new. And then austerity below that, in the other reaches, the lower reaches of society, that's all new. And you might say that under these circumstances, you can't have democracy. It'd be impossible for democracy to continue. Those who think this way have no difficulty pointing to the examples of the weakness of democracy in various ways, but they're especially interested in the rise of kind of a neo-fascist tendency on the right. A tendency associated with nationalism, let's say anti-global, that rallies the people of the country behind the richest elements in society. Pluto-populism, it is sometimes called. Donald Trump is supposed to be an example of this Pluto-populism that some of the press has talked about. Democracy on the rise and the rise of a neo-fascist tendency is something that perhaps you can note in various European societies on the right. A former neo-fascist tendency under Marine Le Pen in France may have power shortly. I mean, I have no doubt that she will be much more moderate than her organization was several years ago, but nevertheless, that's where it comes from on the spectrum. And so there is that tendency, that worrisome tendency on the right, and it extends to the United States. And the threat to democracy, of course, as you know, from the events of the last year or so, extends to the United States and perhaps centers on the United States, making a struggle to keep democracy in being in the United States may be the center of a world struggle to defend democracy on a global basis. So those are all the tendencies. And what does this mean for us as world historians? How should we view the thing, standing back from it and looking at all the stuff we've talked about this semester? Frieden gives us a very, in my opinion, very, very suggestive world historical generalization according to what might be called long waves of capitalist development. And you know that he has a description of these long waves in terms of a kind of a roller coaster. Capitalism develops in this very dramatic way in the 19th century on a globalist basis under the pound, gold standard, and then it crashes somehow. Frieden can't exactly put his finger on why it crashes. I tried to give an example in terms of the diplomatic history of the period and the balance of power. But at any rate, it crashes, it falls in World War I, and then it continues its downward trend in the Great Depression, and then it starts to rise again. So at the end of the 19th century, we get the roller coaster coming up again as it did at the end, or excuse me, the end of the 20th century, we get the roller coaster coming up again as it did at the end of the of the 19th century, and that's the model. It's this long, these long waves of development. According to that model, though, we should be coming into a kind of an analogy, or analog, I should say, an analog of World War I, World War III. I mean, this is Frieden's argument. And of course, he talks about capitalism stumbles, but he doesn't raise this question. Is it going to stumble as badly as capitalism stumbled at the end of the 19th century? Is it going to have a war? Is it going to stumble into war? So that's a thought that definitely slaps us in the face when we read Frieden and try to understand it in the long run. Are we on a certain tendency, on a certain logic, riding a certain wave, we could say, toward a big war? A question we have to ask. So I don't know, is there a way forward out of all this? If someone asks me the things that you put confidence in, I guess I would have to answer, yes, I think there are some things. The historian is always running through history and rerunning everything. You know how you go to see a movie, a mystery or film noir or suspense film or something, you see the hero get into a difficult spot. He's in with a bad person who's leading him or her into all sorts of trouble. And all through the thing, you're thinking, gee, if I were in that position, I wouldn't allow that thing to get so out of hand. I wouldn't bet so much on such and such a thing. I wouldn't have confidence when so and so, or it's a horror story, and the people are wandering around a haunted house. I wouldn't look into that closet. I wouldn't. You're always imagining, and the historian does that with history. Always thinking, how could this have been avoided if one was on the scene with a certain amount of, knowledge about how the thing would turn out. That is to say, what would reason say about the developments that we know when we look at history, we're not necessarily looking at what would normally be thought of as a normal, rational process unfolding before our eyes. We get all sorts of contradictory things. Hegel said history was a slaughter bench of the people. The people's happiness was constantly being slaughtered by history and these horrible events. But he did say that when you looked at it rationally, it would look rationally back. You could see in all these awful things, or at any rate, these irrational things, you could see some kind of a logic. And he said the logic, the spirit of history was freedom. Very powerful thought in the 19th century. It's a powerful thought in the 20th century. I don't know how powerful it is in the 21st century. Too bad. That's one of the things I've always believed in, the way medieval men believed in God, that the passion of history was freedom. But I have my doubts about it now. I don't understand history. I wonder if it still goes. Well, you would think there would be ways out of this thing. Think about all the ways progress has been made in the past, ever since the Enlightenment. Think about all of the very progressive regimes. Think about positivism, people, applying science to human problems, solving problems. Think about the progress that goes on in medicine and things like that. The application of reason. Isn't there a rational way forward? And of course, people who think like that often, and I guess it's no accident, they're liberals. They're on the left. They're progressives, as they're thinking in terms of progress. How to make progress through reason, through the application of reason to these human affairs. That's the problem before. Well, I'm very buoyed up at the moment because the most powerful country on earth, at least so far, the United States, now got a government. At any rate, it it professes that it's going to reinstate some of the old ideas from the past that have provided great progress, great success in the past, the New Deal. If we doubt that progress, the progress that was made between 1929 and 1945, it's very hard to understand any history at all. That you have to say that's progress. Okay, so the Biden administration seems to be at least talking in terms of this kind of progress for the future with its notions of a Green New Deal. Green New Deal. The reason applied to human affairs. Very positive way of seeing things. And what seems to go along with that, a revival of all the best of the left. The best things you can say. You can say a lot of bad things about the left, of course, but think of all the best things you can say about the left. What did it produce during the Cold War period, even after World War II? A détente, a lessening of tensions in the nuclear sphere. Decisive, well, I shouldn't say decisive, very positive action to avoid nuclear war. There's no country that could have a national interest in nuclear war, it strikes me. So détente, big step forward there. And other thoughts, that there's a kind of a convergence of industrial society, of modern societies. They may be run in different ways, but they're structured in kind of the same way, same kind of industrial jobs. The technology is the same. The technology is going to create a certain kind of stratification in the distribution of rewards and the rest of that. And the great powers, if they think in terms of relaxation of tensions, the next thing they should think of is maybe a condominium, living together and ruling the earth together without war. And maybe their societies converge toward being rather similar, so that the people are able to understand each other culturally and can arrive collectively at progressive solutions. Maybe avoiding the destruction of the earth and its environment, avoiding nuclear war, all the rest of that. And glasnost, this idea that came out of Gorbachev's revolution, the idea that a country with an authoritarian regime can have a campaign, to understand itself better, to review its past, to have a national dialogue that was free and scientific. Glasnost, give voice to ideas that people are afraid to utter. Everybody needs glasnost, it strikes me. Everybody on the globe needs a campaign of its own of glasnost. So these are all very wholesome and rational, positive ideas about the future. We're always doing this. We're always doing this. We're historians. We're always thinking about history as just this crazy series of dramatic extremes, wondering why it couldn't iron out those extremes. Well, if you did think in those terms today, you would be thinking about the social democratic model that Frieden talks about, how successful it was, its merger with liberalism, the New Deal, European social democratic, necessarily North European social democratic model, and how successful this was. Maybe we can go back to those things, and as we lose our confidence in the extremism of globalism, maybe we can go back to these things that were not extreme, that were more rational in the period prior to globalism. In other words, we don't have to go from globalism to some other extreme. We can go back to the past and get back on the track that was providing very solid results before globalism. That would make sense. That would be rational. That's the kind of thing the historian thinks of. But can this happen? We don't know. It's a description of hope rather than confidence, maybe. A big problem that lies in the way, of course, is the remaining issue, you might say the heart and soul of globalism, which is the hegemony of the US dollar throughout the world. So that's the thing we've been talking about through this whole course. And right now it's under threat in a way that it's never been under threat. When it went off gold, to be sure, that's a big thing. But you see all the devices of the 70s gave renewed life, the oil shocks and all the rest of that, all that rearrangement of all the money flows of the world in the 70s and the 80s, rise of finance and all the rest of that, gave new life to the idea of globalism, despite its losing its moorings in gold. But now, if there's going to be a competition with the Chinese, if the Chinese have won the race for globalism, and if they are the ones who are leading globalism and the United States is defecting from globalism in order to oppose China, we run into this problem of the supremacy of the dollar again. So the dollar in this diagram is, used for most of the transactions in the world. And oil, of course, oil sales, the most important. But the Chinese are trying to get away from this dollar, trying to do barter transactions of various sorts, or at any rate, transactions that do not go through the dollar in their trading, for example, with Russia, and in other trading that they do. They're trying to build up the yuan as a rival to the dollar. And in the last year or two, it's been suggested that a lot of the gold that has been bought on the open gold market has ended up in China, and it's going to provide a basis for a gold base to the yuan. So we have to wonder what that will do to this presumed world hegemony of the dollar. Are you going to want to trade if you're neither a Russian, a Chinese, or a US trader? Are you going to want to trade in a currency that's based on gold as opposed to one that is not? The question is going to be answered in the next few years, I would think. And that is the main. So suppose this does get out of the control of the United States while it is waging this geopolitical struggle against the Chinese and against the Russians. It does involve a certain amount of military demonstration throughout. Aren't we talking about a tendency toward war? Can the United States defend the dollar without resorting to war? Or is there no other way out? Does the United States have to resort to the balance of power? It's been done in the past. And I've always tried to make the argument the balance of power is not natural and mechanistic. It is something a hegemonic country, Britain at the end of the 19th century, for example, resorts to when everything else appears exhausted. It's a last resort. And the reason it's a last resort is that it means war. As I say, balance is going to be restored. When you talk about a balance of power, it's going to be restored by the application of force, by military action. You can't be afraid of that if you're going to think in terms of the balance of power. So that's the question. How to enforce this dollar hegemony, which cannot be enforced by the forces of the market anymore. Forces of the market, they're controlled by the Chinese, by someone else. There has to be some kind of political, military way of intervening in these economic processes, arming the Ukraine, encouraging Japanese nuclear weapons, all sorts of devices to restore a balance of power. That's the way many are going to be thinking about the thing as we go forward in the future. I see this as a struggle between reason and unreason. history is driving us toward this conclusion, which is, I think, going to turn out badly for everybody. It may be that there's a force driving toward war. I think Frieden probably thinks this. Look at the chapters in Frieden where he talks about the down periods in his model, the descent of the globalist fortunes in his model. Isn't he talking about a descent toward war? Now, historians don't think this way. We think about reason, and we're positivists. We want to see a rational alternative. We want a continuation of the Enlightenment. We're leftists. We like progress. But is history on our side? Or is history just ready to have a big laugh at our expense? Is history in love with extremes? That's the question. Well, I have a question there, but I don't have an answer. And I have to leave things in that way. So thanks for your attention to our discussion of globalism.